Okay, let's dive straight into this explainer. Today we're objectively mapping out the compounding domestic crises facing Russia in 2025 and 2026. We're going to rely on some really fascinating, exclusive data from global economic and strategic institutes. Think the Kiel Institute, the Institute for the Study of War, and the Ness Center. Basically, we want to examine the structural limits of a nation that is now 4 years into a major conflict. We'll be looking directly at the numbers to understand exactly how systemic stress is completely reshaping the Russian state.
Here's a quick look at our roadmap. We'll kick things off with the 2026 fuel crisis, then look at the exhausted war economy, analyze the demographic squeeze, check out their desperate recruitment measures, and finally, define what this new normal actually looks like.
So, we are starting with this pretty jarring question. How exactly does a global oil giant run out of gas? When you look at the data from the summer of 2026, it reveals a shocking reality: massive gasoline rationing in a major petrostate. It sounds paradoxical, right? One of the world's absolute largest energy producers is literally struggling to put fuel in its citizens' cars. But, as we'll see, it is the direct result of a highly targeted campaign.
That brings us to Section 1, the 2026 fuel crisis. Let's look at how a few isolated incidents snowballed into a nationwide emergency.
You really have to notice the sheer chronological escalation of the Ukrainian deep strike campaign on Russian oil infrastructure here. Looking at the data, the trajectory jumps from just 3 strikes in the very first year to a staggering 305 by mid-2026. The impact wasn't immediate, obviously, but the cumulative effect of these repeated, coordinated waves of drones meant that Russian refineries simply could not be repaired fast enough before the next attack hit. It's like a giant game of whack-a-mole, but you're losing badly.
To counter these localized shortages, the government had to institute some extreme mitigation strategies. We're talking about drivers waiting up to 39 hours at pumps in places like Zabaikalsky Krai. 39 hours! By July 2026, roughly 2/3 of Russia's regions were reporting fuel supply issues. In Crimea, authorities actually went as far as declaring a state of emergency and banning fuel sales entirely. In other regions, they had to introduce alternating license plate rotation systems. So, you could only buy gas on even or odd days, depending on your plate.
But the most dramatic step was Prime Minister Mishustin signing a decree that allowed refineries to lower their production standards all the way back to Euro 3. Now, if you're not familiar, this is a heavily polluting fuel with a super high sulfur content. It was actually banned in Russia over a decade ago. This really hits the nail on the head regarding the level of systemic stress we're talking about. The government is actively walking back years of environmental and safety regulations just to keep the domestic economy from grinding to a halt.
This quote from analyst Jade McGlynn perfectly captures why this matters on a human level. Up until this point, the economic impacts for many average citizens were completely hidden or delayed. But the fuel crisis? That is the exact moment the macroeconomic costs of the conflict became a tangible, unavoidable, everyday reality for the Russian public. You just can't ignore a 39-hour wait for gas.
So these fuel shortages are really just a surface-level symptom of much deeper structural exhaustion. That brings us to Section 2, an exhausted war economy, and its rapidly depleting fiscal buffers.
According to the Kiel Institute, Russia's liquid sovereign wealth fund assets completely plummeted. They went from 6.5% of their GDP at the beginning of the war down to a mere 1.8% by April 2026. The fiscal buffers that allowed the Russian economy to easily weather that initial wave of Western sanctions, well, they are now largely depleted. To make up for it, the government has had to rely heavily on off-budget financing and rapid credit expansion just to keep sustaining its military spending.
Now, to survive this massive financial drain, Moscow pivoted east. They created what analysts call an asymmetric partnership. In this setup, Russia definitely gets a vital short-term lifeline. They desperately need Chinese demand for their exports, and they rely on China for about 75% of their sanctioned critical military components. But the catch? In exchange, China gains immense long-term leverage. They are essentially dictating the terms of the relationship, gradually gaining control over Russian trade, finance, and industrial supply chains. It's totally a partnership of dependence.
Compounding all these depleted fiscal buffers is a fundamental lack of human capital. Let's move on to Section 3, the demographic squeeze.
The government has been desperately attempting to incentivize larger families. They even designated 2024 as the year of the family. But despite all that, the data shows that birth rates are actually shrinking. In early 2025, registered births fell by 2.3%. Demographers have noted that the pool of childbearing-aged women is actively decreasing right now, and the sheer uncertainty of the conflict is only accelerating these long-term demographic declines.
This labor and demographic shortage is getting so severe that regional governments are turning to some incredibly unconventional urgent measures just to meet childbirth quotas and staff empty factories. I mean, we're seeing regions offer 100,000 ruble payouts directly to pregnant students. There are even proposals for shortened workdays to incentivize childbirth. Meanwhile, massive labor shortages, like a 200,000-person gap in the construction industry alone, are forcing the state to rapidly integrate demobilized veterans just to keep basic domestic industries functioning.
This severe lack of domestic manpower bleeds directly into Section 4, desperate recruitment measures, and the massive surge pricing we're seeing for troops. The Institute for the Study of War has meticulously tracked this scramble for troops. The overarching goal for the Russian state is crystal clear here. They have to expand combat power, but they need to do it without triggering a general mobilization, which could totally undermine regime stability. So they have to rely on volunteers. And doing that requires some truly massive financial incentives. To put that into perspective, by April 2025, the average one-time enlistment bonus offered to a recruit surged to over 1.5 million rubles. That is a staggering sum of money. It represents a total reliance on financial incentives to convince citizens to sign a military contract. Analysts estimate that between the regional and federal bonuses, the state is spending around 2 billion rubles a day, literally every single day, just on sign-on payments. If you track this desperate surge pricing in specific regions, it reveals a pretty stark reality. Look at Primorsky Krai for a second. Prior to January 1st, the bonus was 800,000 rubles. By April 1st, it had completely skyrocketed to 2.5 million rubles. It more than tripled in just 4 months. This kind of surge pricing is a huge indicator that standard financial offers just weren't enough anymore to attract the manpower needed for a protracted conflict.
And when money isn't enough, the state is bypassing standard demographic polls altogether. There are verified reports confirming the military has tricked foreign nationals, including Chinese citizens, into combat roles under the guise of high-paying construction jobs. On top of that, they are actually fast-tracking legislation to grant combat veteran status to Orthodox priests who serve in combat zones. This is highly controversial, mostly because it apparently violates the 66th Apostolic Canon, which requires defrocking any priest who participates in combat. It just goes to show you how extremely wide the net is being cast.
Okay, let's tie all of this data together in Section 5, the new normal of a fractured petrostate.
We return to exactly where we started, with over 42% of its oil refining capacity knocked offline by Ukrainian drones. According to military estimates, the bedrock of the Russian economy is objectively fractured. The very commodity that funds the state is under severe compounding pressure. And that's what's leading directly to domestic rationing and crippled export revenues.
Yet simultaneously, sectors tied directly to the war effort are absolutely exploding. Just look at the civilian and military drone industry. Revenues nearly quadrupled from 22.9 billion rubles in 2022 to 84.2 billion by 2024. The Kremlin is pushing this targeted militarization of the civilian sector, funding thousands of specialized drone classes in schools and pushing massive domestic production. So it's a dual reality. You have a hollowed-out civilian economy struggling for basic gas and labor, sitting right alongside a booming, hyper-militarized industrial base.
So what does this all mean? We are looking at a system that is robustly surviving the present while rapidly mortgaging its future. The financial buffers are gone, the labor pool is shrinking, and basic energy infrastructure is heavily damaged. It leaves us with one final undeniable question to think about. What is the breaking point of a modern war economy, and just how long can this tower stand before the final block is pulled?